Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. On the program today, we learn more about a new study that shows an increase in water conflicts across the globe. But first, we start off with some election news. U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson was in Las Cruces recently to campaign for District 2 Republican congressional candidate Yvette Herrell. During the visit, members of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium called on Speaker Johnson to extend and expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to include more communities who say they have been affected by nuclear testing and uranium mining. Some of those communities right here in New Mexico. KRWG's Johnny Coker has more.
U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson and 2nd Congressional District Republican candidate Yvette Herrell began their day at a closed event at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum. Dozens of protesters stood outside of the museum, with many representing the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. Tina Cordova, co-founder of the group, called on Speaker Johnson to bring Senate Bill 3853 to the floor for a vote to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for New Mexicans who say they were irradiated by nuclear testing in the state, and said she wasn't confident in Herrell to push the issue.
When Yvette Herrell served in Congress, she eventually became a co-sponsor to the bill that would extend and expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. But over the last 3 months, she's taken 3 different positions. We don't know where she lands on this. The most recent position was that she supports us and that she would speak to Mike Johnson about it while he's here. But the bottom line is we requested a face-to-face meeting and she's the gatekeeper. She could have made sure that that happened. She could have made sure that we were on the inside, not on the outside, standing here protesting.
After leaving the Farm and Ranch Museum, the House Speaker and former Congresswoman spoke at a public event for the launch of the National Republican Congressional Committee's campaign office within the city.
Our nation is in harm's way, and the harm is this administration and these policies that are killing our country. And here we are. Because of the importance of the next 70 days or 80 days, this is why we're getting together. This is why we're coming out, because you have to be encouraged, you have to be educated, and you have to know what is at stake and where the positions are. And believe me, it could not be more stark.
The pair spoke to local party members and supporters for about 20 minutes on issues including immigration and public safety. Speaker Johnson also talked about election security and voting irregularities, despite evidence showing there was no widespread fraud during the 2020 election.
We're worried about some of the swing states. And some of these states, they got crazy rules, right? So we got to play by the rules that are presented. If that's in California, they have ballot harvesting, okay? Democrats clean our clocks on that because they ballot harvest like professionals. What we're doing this time around is we're recruiting and training Republican ballot harvesters. We got to beat them at their own game, okay? Yes.
There was no comment or acknowledgement of Rika or the protesters that followed the pair to the campaign office. KRWG requested an interview with the House Speaker as well as Yvette Herrell, but an NRCC spokesperson told us that neither would be available for press, citing the pair's busy schedule. As Election Day draws closer, fundraising efforts by both campaigns are heating up, with Herrell's campaign raising nearly $2.5 million between January 2023 and June of 2024, and Congressman Vasquez's campaign raising nearly $4 million in that same time period. The race for the state's 2nd congressional district is expected to be close, attracting national attention as it could influence control of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2025. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker.
You may have heard this saying here in the Southwest that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. We're certainly familiar with lawsuits over water in our region. But new research from the Pacific Institute, a global think tank focused on sustainable water policy and solutions, shows that in many regions across the globe, there's a rise in armed conflicts over access to water. Here to share more about their work is Dr. Peter Glick, Senior Fellow and co-founder of the Pacific Institute, and Morgan Shimabuku, senior researcher with the Institute. I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
Peter, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us about the water conflict chronology and how this research is gathered?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Pacific Institute, our institute, is a nonprofit independent research institute, and we look at global water issues quite widely: water and climate, water and equity, water and security, access to safe water. And one of the projects we've had for many, many years is to try and understand the relationship between access to water and water infrastructure and violent conflict. And for a long time, we've been collecting data in something called the water conflict chronology that looks at conflicts over water, violence associated with water resources around the world. And we look at it in three groups. We look at where water has been a trigger of violence, disputes over access to water or control of water, where water or water infrastructure has been used as a weapon of conflicts that may start for other reasons, and where water or water infrastructure has been a casualty or target of conflict, where water systems have been attacked in conflicts over water. And we maintain this database. It's an open source database at the Pacific Institute, and it tracks these violent events going back many, many years, actually almost 4,000 years, to the ancient past and up to most recent events we've seen.
Morgan, can you share with us about the most recent research and what you were looking at in the most recent years?
Absolutely. So this year in 2024, we did a major update to the water conflict chronology and added over 300 new instances of water-related violent conflict from around the world. So as Peter was just describing, we added new instances where water has been a trigger, a weapon, or a casualty of conflict. Most of these instances occurred in 2023, but we've did do some update of previous years as well. And really, what I'll highlight initially is that we have discovered that the trend in increasing water-related violent conflict around the world is accelerating, with 2023 having by far the most number of events of any year we've ever tracked previously.
Peter, from your research, what seems to be the major causes of this water-related violence?
Well, there are many different causes. Again, because we look at these three categories, they're all a little bit different. Where water is a trigger of conflict, the causes seem to be violence over access to limited water resources, where water is scarce, where there's a drought, where there's disputes over water rights, where there are fights between farmers and the cities over access to limited water resources, including, unfortunately, now we see some of the effects of climate change that's causing changes in extreme hydrologic events that's causing violence. Where water has been a casualty of conflict, we see this in war zones. We see this in the Ukraine, in the Russia-Ukraine war. We see this in the Middle East, in violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians, where water systems are targets or casualties of conflict. And there are a number of events, quite a number of events in the last several years in these conflict zones where water has been targeted specifically.
Peter, can we talk about that a little bit more and dive into just what sort of attacks and violence we're seeing in some of those areas you mentioned? Of course, our audience is certainly familiar with the conflict going on in Israel and Palestine. Can you share with us a little bit more about what were some of the findings there?
Yeah, so some examples from the Middle East, which I have to say has a long history of conflict over water. Some of the very first entries thousands of years ago are in this same region over water resources because it's a very arid region. Water is scarce. There's political, religious, ideological conflicts going on in any case. In the last few years, we've seen a real uptick in violence in this region where water systems have been attacked in the West Bank. Palestinian water systems have been attacked. Dams have been destroyed. In Gaza, after Hamas attacked Israel in October of 2023, Israel, of course, responded very aggressively, attacking Gaza and destroying a lot of the water infrastructure in Gaza, attacking desalination plants, water treatment plants, cutting off water in a pipeline that Israel was supplying water to Gaza. So cutting off water to Gaza. Those are a number of examples. In the Ukraine, we've seen a lot of the similar things. We've seen, in particular in 2023, the destruction of Kakhovka Dam, one of the largest dams in Europe on the Dnieper River, blown up, we believe, by the Russians, and many other attacks on civilian water infrastructure in some of the cities in the Ukraine, attacks on energy systems that shut down water systems in the Ukraine. These are all examples where water has been a target or a casualty of wars that are going on.
Now, Peter, you mentioned that water infrastructure being targeted, and some of these communities, we're talking about very large communities, aren't we?
Yes, very large. So, again, in the Ukraine, the destruction of Kakhovka Dam cut off the water supply for some of the largest cities in Ukraine and are forcing Ukraine to find new alternative sources of water. That same destruction of that big dam, that dam used to supply water for hundreds of thousands of acres of irrigated land in the Ukraine. Ukraine produces quite a bit of food for world markets. And the Ukraine, again, is scrambling to find irrigation water so they can grow food for some of those export markets. It's some of the examples of the consequences of these attacks, this violence associated with water systems.
Morgan, can you share with us a little bit more about just how many areas in the world that water violence is really happening?
Sure. Unfortunately, we see water violence happening in almost all corners and all regions across the globe. In the past 2 decades, there's been water conflicts on every continent except for Antarctica. And so it's not just one sort of area. There are places where you could call them hotspots. We see a lot of conflict more recently in certain parts of Africa, such as the Sahel region. We see it in India, in the Middle East, as we've discussed. Also in Latin America, down primarily in South and Central America, and all the way up to close to the U.S.-Mexico border. So it really does span the globe.
Peter, what is the ripple effect of these conflicts like? Can you share with us a little bit about how water-related violence could perhaps turn into other types of violence?
Sure, I would add to the last question that we do see more conflicts over water in places where institutions are weak, or where respect for law is bad, or where ongoing conflicts are occurring, other wars for other reasons. In Western Europe, the United States, we see far fewer violent conflicts over water, although we fight over water here with lawyers, as you pointed out in your introduction. But at the moment, fortunately, we're not really fighting violently over water resources. But some of the consequences are, of course, cutting off water and safe water and sanitation for populations. When you destroy water infrastructure in cities, people don't have access to safe water and sanitation. We see outbreaks of water-related diseases in those places. We see competition over economic resources where water is scarce. That's one of the problems associated with drought and now with climate change. We see places that used to have reliable sources of water are increasingly water short, and that's causing economic problems. It's causing problems for agricultural production. These are some of the knock-on effects that we see.
Can we talk a little bit more about climate change and the impact that it's really having on this issue? Morgan, I'll go ahead and start with you. Can you kind of share with us a little bit about what we're seeing as more and more places are dealing with the effects of climate change?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that we at Pacific Institute are really interested in doing a lot more work on to explore the sort of direct on-the-ground impacts of climate change and water and conflict. But what we do know is that climate change is making water much more scarce and is making it much more challenging for farmers, cities, and other groups to access, and that can be a major source of conflict. In places where there's already sort of changes in the hydrologic cycle with less rain, or even major flooding events that wash away infrastructure, these places have been having more challenges in just getting water for everyday uses, and conflicts can arise out of those. I do want to say Peter Glick, who can expand more on this, has done analysis that shows the contribution of climate change to some conflicts, for example, in Syria back in the 2010s, and how that contributed to the very violent conflict there. But more work is really needed to tease out that connection.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about that, Peter. I mean,
Sure.
you've done some research on that. Can you share a little bit about that and just how water-related violence is just, impacting so many different areas in the world and different issues, like with what we saw in Syria, another effect like migration?
Yeah, so very simply, we know climate's changing. We know humans are responsible. There's no scientific debate about that anymore. And we know that some of the most significant impacts will be on water resources. Higher temperatures means more evaporation. We're seeing more extreme events, both flooding and droughts. Storms are getting stronger. And that affects water resources around the world. We see it in Texas. We see it in New Mexico, where higher temperatures are causing more demand for water. It's causing more and more stress on some of the local water resources. That's just the reality. The conflict connection that Morgan mentioned, we saw in Syria in the 2010s, a very severe drought hit the Mediterranean region, including parts of Syria, that scientists know was worsened by climate change. That drought was more severe than it otherwise would have been. That caused agricultural disruptions in Syria. That caused economic disruptions and populations to move to some of the populated areas from the rural areas in Syria. And that contributed to what became the Syrian civil war, a very severe conflict in that region. And as you note, one of the consequences of that war was a massive migration. People left Syria, millions of people fled the region into Europe. That caused economic problems, it caused social and political problems. It just shows how connected all of these things are: climate, to food, to economics, to migration. These are some of the growing concerns that we have about understanding the connections between water and violence.
So what do we know so far about the response from an organization like the United Nations on this issue?
Well, so there is a growing awareness of these issues. Growing attention is being paid to the connections between water and violence. And the whole purpose of our research is really to try and find solutions to this. If we understand what's driving conflicts over water, then we can develop solutions and strategies to reduce the risks of conflicts over water. If it's scarcity and disputes about water rights, then providing safe water and sanitation to everyone can help reduce disputes over who has access to water. If it's fights between farmers and cities over allocations of irrigation water, we can figure out strategies to reduce those conflicts. If it's a conflict that crosses borders between two nations that share a river, transboundary agreements are important. The U.S. has an agreement with Mexico over the Colorado River and the Rio Grande, and at the moment, we're not violently fighting over those water resources. We have a mechanism to negotiate, to diplomatically discuss disputes over water. So understanding the causes is important so we can work on developing solutions to those disputes.
And about solutions, I'd like to hear from you both. How do you feel this research can really make a difference? Morgan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I really enjoy this research because I do think that it is first and foremost really raising awareness about this critical issue. We've received a lot of good feedback this year that this issue is getting more and more recognition on the global scale by actors who can really make a difference. So that's really important. And I think that the other critical impact is just especially bringing awareness to the places that may or may not be in the spotlight. So in small communities in Latin America where corporate actors and the government have been fighting with local communities over water resources, perhaps this database can really bring to light those issues.
Peter, what do you hope this research can shine light on and provide for people interested in this topic?
Well, we really have two objectives to doing this work. One is to try and understand the causes of water-related violence and the trends, the regional issues associated with that. And the second is to try and understand solutions to these problems, to reduce the risks of conflicts over water. As Morgan said earlier, the trend is in the wrong direction. 2023 was by far the worst year we've seen, and it was much higher than 2022, but 2022 had many more instances of violence than 2021. The trends are in the wrong direction. If we can understand what's causing conflicts over water, we can develop solutions to those problems. That's our objective in the long run. Morgan and I just participated in a major international conference in Sweden where this was the major topic, conflict over water resources and water security. There is a growing awareness. As you mentioned, the UN is paying more attention to this. Countries are paying more attention to this. We'd like to see more international law so that violations of attacks on civilian water infrastructure were enforced and prosecuted. We'd like to see more attention to the fact that there are billions of people that don't have access to safe water worldwide. You know, we sort of take that for granted here in the United States, mostly. We're lucky mostly in the United States. But not everybody has access to safe water and sanitation. And when that's a source of conflict, we know that we need to provide those resources for people.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us. Dr. Peter Glick is a senior fellow and co-founder of the Pacific Institute, and Morgan Shimabuku is senior researcher with the Institute. Thank you both for joining us again. We're going to move on now to talk about affordable housing in New Mexico. It continues to be a challenge, but in Las Cruces, steps are being taken to improve the situation. KRWG's Johnny Coker reports.
As New Mexico's housing crisis deepens, instances of homelessness continue to rise. This was the reality for Janelle Kanekua. She left her home state of Hawaii for New Mexico in 2020, but was unable to secure stable housing as the coronavirus pandemic swept across the world. That is, until she learned about the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope from a caseworker.
We were waiting at a park. We stayed in the park. And some guy came and he told us about the Community of Hope and how good everybody was there, and she told us to give them a call. So every day I would call because there was a waiting list to get into Tent City. And one day I called and she said, I was just about to call you. We got an open space. And I was like, what? So we moved into Tent City. The dog was happy. They gave us a tent, sleeping bags. It was a smooth transition from the park to the tents.
According to the latest data collected by the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness Point-in-Time Count, individuals in the state experiencing homelessness in January of 2024 was 4,649, up from 2023's 3,842, an increase of roughly 21%. Kanekua said she lived at Camp Hope for a full year, utilizing the facilities and working with counselors until a space became free for her at the Desert Hope Apartments.
It was joy when they told us they were moving us in. More confidence to go out and, go get a job, be out in the public. Hats off to Camp Community of Hope.
The need for affordable housing in the U.S. is on the rise. In New Mexico, since 2017, rent has skyrocketed 70%, according to a report from the state's Legislative Finance Committee. Like many other municipalities across the nation, the city of Las Cruces is trying to keep up with the demand, and this year broke ground on 2 affordable housing projects. Intended for senior and family housing, there will be 150 new units available by the time that construction is complete, but that's just a drop in the bucket for the shortage of 5,600 rental units that the city identified, according to Natalie Green, the city's Housing and Neighborhood Services Administrator.
We have about 900 units coming online in the next couple of years. This year alone, we'll have the 150. So we have this 80, another 70, and then we are about to close on another 144 units. So the city's actively working to build capacity. In addition to that, we have some great policy initiatives like the Realize Las Cruces that will help increase accessory dwelling units in single-family neighborhoods so people can build a casita, help support those multi-generational households that I think are going to become more prevalent as the housing crisis exacerbates.
Green said that the city has built good relationships with developers and is confident that Las Cruces is an attractive place for them to construct affordable housing units, but said that finding where to put new complexes can be tricky.
Our challenge is going to be finding places to build housing that match up with the New Mexico Mortgage Finance Authority's scoring criteria. A lot of times they prioritize neighborhoods that are concentrated with lower incomes, and so city wants to see more diversity across our neighborhoods, so we want to make sure that we're building in different parts of town. So we'll continue to reach out with the various developers and plan projects through the pipeline.
Beyond city and state, New Mexico's federal designation is also looking for ways to ease the cost of housing for its residents. On a recent visit to southern New Mexico, U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich said that he's in favor of legislation that would incentivize more developers to build more low and moderate income housing, as well as tax credits that could help make housing more attainable for first-time buyers.
We've really struggled with housing. We were building a lot of housing in the early 2000s, and then when that recession hit in 2008 and 2009, we lost a lot of the private sector builders who had been doing that work in New Mexico for decades. We have to rebuild that. We have to have the local capacity to be able to build houses at the clip that will actually reduce the price pressures that we're under, and we still have a lot of work to do there.
With a shortage of thousands of units driving rising costs, the road to stability for many remains a major challenge for local, state, and federal officials to tackle. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker.
That's it for this episode of Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.